Hello, welcome to Western Civ, episode 168, India. Last time, Vasco da Gama fought his way, sometimes, literally, up the East African coast. After antagonizing so many towns that the Sultan of Mombasa tried unsuccessfully to ambush him, he found a sultan in Malindi willing to help him get across the Indian Ocean. In late April 1498, armed with a Christian pilot who knew the route, da Gama set sail for the land he was ordered to reach: India. The secret to crossing the Indian Ocean, it turns out, is simple science. Namely, land heats and cools more quickly than water. Every September, the Tibetan Plateau loses heat fast. When that happens, this enormous wave of cold air whips down the mountains, crosses India, and pours out across the Indian Ocean. Meanwhile, the ocean itself remains warm. But because the warm air rises, this wave of cold air cuts underneath. As a result, those sailing from India to Arabia or Africa are each fall privy to a perfect and natural transportation system. They are simply blown straight to their destination. As the summer approaches, the air above India heats to tremendous degrees. This heat bubble then sucks in the colder air above the Indian Ocean. Hence, those traveling back from Africa to Arabia to India are in essence pulled back to the Indian subcontinent. The cold air then gets yanked into the Himalayas, where it turns into rain clouds that pour down on India during its rainy season. By September, the whole process once more repeats itself. The winter monsoon, a word incidentally that comes from the Arabic word Monsoon, which just means season, dictated the trading calendar of much of the world. Getting to India, however, was trickier than getting back. You had to time it just right. The ideal time to make the voyage was actually at the tail end of the winter monsoon, so late summer. That being said, these same monsoons also bred terrific storms that could smash vessels whole or render them unsailable and sitting ducks for pirates. Consider one Persian report from the 1440s. Quote, "As soon as I caught the smell of the vessel and all the terrors of the sea presented themselves before me, I fell into so deep a swoon that for 3 days, respiration alone indicated that life remained within me. When I came a little to myself, the merchants who were my intimate friends cried with one voice that the time for navigation had passed, and that everyone who put to sea at this season was alone responsible for his death, since he voluntarily placed himself in peril. In consequence of the severity of pitiless weather and the adverse manifestations of treacherous fate, my heart was crushed like glass, and my soul became weary of life." End quote. Sheer dumb luck. Vasco da Gama happened to leave Africa at a fairly opportune moment. Had he arrived in Malindi in September, he would have been out of luck. For 23 days, the crew had little to do other than just watch the blue water zip by as the brisk monsoon wind carried the two ships across the Indian Ocean. On May 18, 1498, the crew spotted land. Vasco da Gama, standing on the deck and staring out, could hardly believe his eyes. He was heading straight for the spice emporium of Calcutta. As he turned to the pilot, the man announced they were only 5 leagues, perhaps 20 miles from their destination. All that in less than 25 days. The men that night crowded the deck as da Gama laid anchor around 4 miles from the shore. What they saw conjured up stories they'd all heard in the past. Bracketed by 2 rocky promontories, a long, sandy beach gave way to palm and fir trees. Truly was paradise. Sadly, the ships were actually anchored by Kapad, a town that the pilot had mistaken for Calcutta, but, he quickly corrected his mistake, so it was okay. Now, Calcutta was the busiest port in all of India. For more than 200 years, it had been the center of the spice trade. Calcutta was located in the bottom third of the Indian subcontinent. It's about 200-ish miles up India's western coast from the very southern tip. Now, at the time that da Gama arrived, the port itself was virtually empty. The various fleets from Arabia, Iran, and Egypt would soon arrive. But da Gama left a bit earlier than the normal time, so he beat everybody else to the punch. The Portuguese' first discovery in India confirmed their greatest hope. There were Christians living there. Sure, they weren't Catholic, and they certainly weren't Orthodox. But hey, beggars can't be choosers. Quote, they, the Christians, are of a tawny complexion. Some of them have big beards and long hair, whilst others clip their hair short or shave their head, merely allowing a tuft to remain on the crown, as a sign that they are Christians. They also wear mustaches. They pierce their ears, and wear much gold in them. They go naked down to the waist, covering their lower extremities with very fine cotton stuffs. But it is the most respectable who do this. For the others, they manage as best as they're able. End quote. But to the Portuguese' dismay, there were far more Muslims in Calcutta than Christians. Once again, priest or John could not be found. The king of Calicut, called the Zamorin, immediately sent a message to da Gama's ships, and the message, happily for the Portuguese, was exceedingly friendly. With the message came a pilot who offered to guide the ships into the harbor of Pantatalini, which was much deeper and which was where the larger ships technically docked most of the time. Luckily, it was only 4 miles away. Da Gama would have probably rejected the offer, assuming it was another trick, but the winds picked up and the skies darkened. Threatened now with the certainty of a storm, da Gama immediately set sail for the port. He did, however, command the pilot to anchor further from the shore than recommended, still wary that this might all be a trick. Here in the morning, so close to the spices he so badly wanted, da Gama determined that he would go to shore himself. This was the purpose of the entire journey, and even if he died here, the risk was worth the success that it might bring. Their guides led the Portuguese to a river, where flat-bottom boats carried them downstream. After traveling about 3 miles down said river, the party disembarked, and da Gama was carried on a litter past spacious homes and gardens as the party approached the outskirts of Calcutta. The city was a sight to behold. Ancient Christian churches competed with mosques for space. The streets were jam-packed with people and animals. Everywhere were the smell of spices da Gama had come so far to collect. In the evening light, Vasco da Gama finally entered the palace and came face to face with the man he had come so far to meet. The throne room was arrayed in the same way that da Gama probably assumed that of the Roman emperors of old had been. The cushions were piled on fine, white cotton sheets, the couch itself resting on rich green velvet. The Zamorin listened intently to why da Gama had come. Of course, The Portuguese explorer was sure to play up just how mutually beneficial their partnership might be. At the end, Zamorin rather abruptly, but in a non-committal way, informed da Gama that he was welcome as a brother and his envoys would be sent out to see what spices might be available. For now, Zamorin declared it was getting late. Would da Gama prefer to lodge with Christians or with Muslims tonight? Christians, da Gama replied. And with a nod, Zamorin was gone. Just a quick plug here in the midst of the show. If you're interested in more content or supporting the show in any way, check out the website, westerncivpodcast.com, or consider becoming a patron at patreon.com. For $1 a month, you get access to every single show early, and you get to submit questions for author interviews and anything else that comes up. For $2 a month, you get access to all of our deep dive episodes, all of the history of Western thought, Search for Atlantis, everything else that I've done over the last several years. It's all yours for $2 a month. Plus, I add about 3 to 4 more hours of content for patrons only every month on the website. Check it out. Link in the show notes. And now, back to da Gama. By the time da Gama arrived in India, the civilizations that began along the Indus River Valley had existed for more than 4,000 years. India was home to 3 major religions: complicated caste system that made feudalism look like a capitalist free market system, countless architectural marvels above just about anything contemporary Europeans could produce, save a few cathedrals, and a staggeringly important intellectual culture. India was home to Christians, Hindus, and Muslims, with some Buddhism sprinkled in for fun. Islam arrived in India in 712, but with the 10th century came rampaging Turkish and Afghan armies that ultimately crushed the might of the existing Hindu powers and grafted themselves over top, much as the Muslims and Goths had done in Spain. Only in southern India, where da Gama landed, had the Hindu kings been able to hold back the Muslim advance. Calcutta, therefore, was not a quote-unquote Muslim city. It was into this ancient and intricate culture that the Portuguese stumbled blindly, like a man groping for his keys in the dark. No one in Portugal had ever even heard of Hinduism, Buddhism, certainly not the Jains, showing just how naive these men were. When they had been in Malindi, many of the sailors mistook the cry Krishna for Christ and assumed that the chanting that they heard was for a Christian service. They also assumed that the drawings and sculptures representing Hindu gods were either exaggerated or poorly drawn Christian saints. Today we hear things like this and we just shake our heads. How could these men have been so foolish? Again, I must remind you that the past is another land, and that these men had heard nothing from the most learned men in their land for years, other than that the world was just Muslim and Christian, and that on the other side of the caliphate was Priester John. Well, were they not on the other side of the caliphate? Therefore, what made sense to these men was that they had stumbled upon a hidden Christian kingdom and then misinterpreted every single thing they saw through that lens. Only a handful of Europeans had ever made it to the Malabar coast, where Da Gama now found himself. And do not forget to consider what the Indians thought by the way of the Europeans. These pale, shabbily dressed men probably looked a lot more like beggars than the representatives of some great and powerful king from a kingdom no one had ever heard of. Even the Zamorin snubbed the worthless trinkets Da Gama tried to give him as gifts. Da Gama waited in his appointed lodging for the Zamorin or his representatives to return. He did not. What happened instead was a steady stream of Muslim merchants who showed up to make fun of the baubles Da Gama had tried to impress the Zamorin with. He had become a laughingstock. Finally, on the third morning, messengers appeared to escort Da Gama to the palace once more. If Da Gama was expecting an apology at the palace, he was sorely mistaken. Quote, "I expected you yesterday," rebuked the Zamorin as soon as Da Gama entered the room. Da Gama clearly had misunderstood the ceremony, and now he realized it. He was supposed to come back of his own accord. He should not have expected to be summoned. Trying to save face, Da Gama meekly replied that he was tired from the long journey. The Zamorin ignored the response but pressed on instead. He critiqued Da Gama sharply, asking what his purpose in coming was. If he had come from such a rich and powerful nation, why had he brought such worthless junk to trade? Da Gama, for his part, tried to press on. He told the Zamorin he did not have anything with him because the object of the voyage had been discovery. Later on, there would be trade. Still unimpressed, the Zamorin demanded to see the letter of introduction from King Manuel. Da Gama produced his letter and handed it to his Muslim translator. Then the plan had a snag. When everyone realized said translator only spoke Arabic, he couldn't read it. Begrudgingly, Da Gama handed the letter to 4 Muslims standing nearby, who read it and began translating it for the Zamorin. The letter said that King Manuel was pleased to learn that this great king, they had kept it vague because no one could be sure what the title might be, was Christian. The Zamorin wasn't, but, everyone just kept moving. Thus, the letter continued, Da Gama was there to establish a treaty with this Christian king that allowed the Portuguese to buy spices directly from the Zamorin, the Christian Zamorin that doesn't exist. Now, finally, the Zamorin, the real one, not the Christian one, seemed pleased. The prospect of new trading partners, no matter how shabby their messengers, was always a good thing. The Zamorin now pressed Da Gama what King Manuel could send in exchange for spices. What items did Portugal produce? Cloth, replied Da Gama, as well as iron, bronze, and many other things. When asked if he had any of those things with him, Da Gama responded he did, but they were only samples. He told the Zamorin that if he could return to his ship, he would come back with them. To his consternation, the Zamorin refused. But he had no intention of detaining Da Gama. He bluntly told Da Gama that he could take all of his men, go back to his ship, and try to sell his goods in the harbor like any other merchant. But the Zamorin added at the end, first the ships needed to come into the harbor. Now Da Gama reddened with rage. If the Zamorin wanted him to stay in the country, that was one thing. His king would know that the Zamorin violated the proposed treaty when his ships returned without him. But he'd do it. He would not, however, give up his ships. Da Gama now seemed to determine not to give up the ships at any cost, and that meant keeping them out of the port. Once within the port, his long-range guns would be useless, and the Zamorin, he believed, would certainly just kill them all. "All right," said the Zamorin, "then if you will not come into the harbor, tell your men to give up their sails and their rudders." Once more, Da Gama fumed with rage. He would do no such thing, he said. He would stay if someone had to stay, but he was not going to give up the ships. Frustrated, the Zamorin sent Da Gama back to his lodgings, this time with an armed guard who waited outside the walls. Da Gama was now effectively a prisoner. After a time, another royal messenger appeared. He told Da Gama that although the law decreed that Da Gama and his men were effectively pirates and should all be killed, the Zamorin, in his infinite kindness, determined to make an exception. All Da Gama had to do was write a letter to the ships, tell them to hand over the promised cargo, and he could go. I'm assuming at this point, Da Gama is so angry, he's probably the color of an overripe tomato. He had promised no such thing, but neither did he have any options. So he wrote a letter to his brother telling him to send all the samples to the shore. Paolo immediately loaded some, not all, of the merchandise onto a boat and complied. Once the goods were taken to a warehouse, the messenger, true to his word, complied, and Da Gama and his men were set free. The chronicler reported, quote, "At this we greatly rejoiced, and rendered thanks to God for having extricated us from the hands of the people who had no more sense than beasts." End quote. Da Gama and his men were far from ready to sail home. Their mission continued to be to find spices, and find them they planned to do. In the days following Da Gama's return to his ship, different visitors continued to row their way up to the ships and see what the Portuguese had to offer. Yet all these merchants were only interested in browsing and bought nothing. Most Muslim merchants came with the seemingly express purpose of scoffing at what Da Gama had to offer. Da Gama bared it all patiently, sending back the occasional message to the Zamorin, complaining about how he was being treated and reminding him that he and his ships stood ready to do whatever needed to be done to solidify a trade deal. But at some point, it was painfully obvious that no one was going to be buying even one bale of cloth. It was now late June. The sea rose and fell with frightening regularity. Rain pelted the decks for hours on end. Finally, Da Gama realized he better let his men make the best of it and allowed them each to go ashore and barter whatever personal goods they had for spices. He only allowed one man to go per ship ashore at a time, reckoning that it was safer than risking the capture or loss of an entire body of men. Now, the men who went ashore to sell what they had, no clue what they were selling, by the way, that must have been some kind of a culture shock. Regardless, after a crash course in Indian culture, that they did, and they found exactly what Da Gama found. Namely, that Portuguese goods had very little value here. A fine garment in Portugal was worth around 10% of what it was in Portugal. If the Portuguese expected to land and be treated as gods, they were sorely mistaken. By August, da Gama was ready to head home. He decided to send his clerk, Diogo Diaz, to the Zamorin with a chest of precious items for one last-ditch effort at getting a large quantity of spices. After keeping Diaz waiting for 4 days, the Zamorin quickly dismissed the gifts and informed Diaz that the Portuguese would need to pay the customary departure tax before leaving. Diaz bowed, said he would deliver the message, and left. But he never made it to da Gama. Zamorin had him tailed from the moment he left the palace, and as soon as he entered the Portuguese warehouse, where they were now storing most of the goods that no one wanted, armed men surrounded the doors. Diaz and his men were now prisoners in the warehouse. After learning Diaz was imprisoned, da Gama tried to piece together what had gone wrong. Through a few friendly contacts, da Gama finally came to understand that the Muslim merchants in the city had essentially conspired against him. After da Gama showed up the first time and met with the Zamorin, without a sufficient tribute, his fate had been sealed. Muslim merchants, who saw da Gama as a threat to their business, convinced the Zamorin that the Portuguese had not come from the king, but were privateers and were banned from their own country. And even if this Portuguese king were real, why waste a bird in the hand for two in the bush? The Zamorin was making a handsome profit off his Muslim contacts. Why jeopardize that? Ultimately, the Zamorin agreed. That all being said, the harsh reality for da Gama was that he messed up. As an ambassador and merchant, he was supposed to pay handsomely for enjoying the Zamorin's protection. He had not. Now he had to deal with the consequences. As a result, the Portuguese were now left with only one option: brute force.